What if the forest could think? What if it could see you, lure you deeper, and feed on your fear? In 1815, 9 seasoned fur trappers ventured into Idaho's uncharted wilderness, but only 3 would return. They thought they were prepared for anything, but the forest had secrets no map could reveal: an abandoned camp, a cursed journal, shadows that whispered your name in the voice of the dead. As their numbers dwindled, the men uncovered a sinister truth. This forest wasn't just alive, it was hungry. Will they escape the clutches of a place that bends reality itself, or will they become part of its legend forever? Stay with us as we unravel the chilling tale of the Whispering Forest. This isn't just a story, it's a nightmare you won't forget. In the year 1815, the Big Creek River wilderness seemed to stretch into eternity. For the 9 fur trappers trekking through Idaho's dense forest, this desolation was familiar. They were seasoned survivalists, their faces weathered from years of braving nature's wrath. Yet, as they ventured deeper into an uncharted forest, unease began to seep into their collective resolve. The trees loomed high and close, their tangled branches forming a canopy so dense that sunlight could barely penetrate. Shadows stretched long, distorting the landscape into something alien. The air was unnaturally still. No bird song, no rustling leaves, just a heavy, suffocating silence. "Stay sharp," Ephraim Walker, their leader, barked. He was a man of few words, his grizzled appearance a testament to decades of frontier hardship. His sharp eyes scanned the path ahead, as if expecting danger to spring from the earth itself. It wasn't long before they stumbled upon the first anomaly: an abandoned campsite. The signs of recent habitation were undeniable. Ashes in the fire, pit still carried a faint warmth, and pots lay overturned, as though someone had left in a hurry. Blankets were strewn about, half buried in dirt. "What happened here?" one of the younger trappers whispered, his voice trembling. Ephraim didn't answer immediately. He knelt by the fire pit, his rough hands brushing away dirt and ash. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. He couldn't put his finger on it, but the air felt charged, like the aftermath of a lightning strike. As he moved to inspect the rest of the site, his boots struck something hard beneath the soil. Dropping to one knee, Ephraim unearthed a small, tightly wrapped bundle. The object was encased in a weathered beaver pelt, bound with frayed leather ties. "What is it?" another trapper asked, crowding closer. Ephraim's hands trembled slightly as he undid the ties, revealing a leather-bound journal. Its cover was cracked with age, but the pages inside were surprisingly well preserved. The trappers gathered around him, their unease replaced by curiosity. Ephraim flipped through the pages, his brows furrowing as he skimmed the handwritten entries. Each word seemed to drag him deeper into a well of dread. The journal told a fragmented tale of fear, paranoia, and something unexplainable. "It's a warning," Ephraim finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. He looked up at his companions, his normally stoic expression cracked with fear. "This place, it's cursed." The trappers exchanged uneasy glances. No one laughed. No one dismissed Ephraim's words as superstition. The stillness of the forest seemed to tighten around them, and the shadows grew darker. "Let's move," Ephraim ordered, shoving the journal into his pack. But as they turned to leave, a cold wind swept through the camp, carrying with it a faint whisper. Too low to make out, but unmistakably there. The men froze. Even the bravest among them felt their hearts race. They were no longer alone in the forest. The trappers left the abandoned campsite in tense silence, their usual banter replaced by stolen glances at the darkened woods around them. Ephraim Walker, always the most unshakable of the group, walked ahead with the journal pressed tightly to his chest. Whatever was written in those pages weighed on him. His broad shoulders, once proud, now seemed hunched under an invisible burden. The forest felt alive, but not in a way that inspired wonder. There was something oppressive in the air, as though unseen eyes were watching their every step. Even the youngest of the group, Samuel, who often cracked jokes to ease tension, stayed, uncharacteristically quiet, his face pale as he scanned the surrounding trees. "Does it say what happened to them?" One of the men, Amos, finally broke the silence, his voice shaky but curious. Ephraim didn't turn around. "Not entirely," he replied, his voice low and grim. "But it's not good. They were losing each other, disappearing one by one, supplies vanishing. They thought it was the forest itself, playing tricks on them." "Tricks?" Amos asked, swallowing hard. Ephraim stopped abruptly and turned to face the group, his face stern. "Listen to me. No one strays from the group. No one. Keep your eyes ahead. Stay close. And don't pay attention to the damn shadows." The warning sent a shiver through the men. Ephraim wasn't one to speak of curses or superstitions. If he was rattled, it meant something was deeply wrong. They pressed on, the forest growing thicker and darker with each passing hour. The ground beneath their boots turned soft, almost marsh-like, though there had been no sign of a swamp on their maps. The trees seemed to twist unnaturally, their gnarled, branches clawing at the sky like skeletal hands. "Walker," Samuel whispered, his voice barely audible. "Are we lost?" Ephraim didn't respond immediately, but the truth was evident in his silence. The path they had been following had vanished, as if swallowed by the forest itself. There were no landmarks, no signs of the Big Creek River they had followed faithfully for days. It was as though they had stepped into another world entirely. "Let's rest," Ephraim finally said, his voice heavy. The men dropped their packs in a small clearing, their movements sluggish from exhaustion. Amos worked to start a fire, his hands trembling as he struck flint against steel. The flames sputtered to life, but gave off little comfort. Ephraim pulled the journal from his pack and began to read aloud, his voice steady but tinged with unease. The nights grow longer. The shadows shift even when there is no wind. We've begun hearing things, voices, whispers in the dark. One by one, the men are disappearing, their belongings left behind as if they simply walked into the forest and vanished. Last night, I heard my name. It was my mother's voice, but she has been dead for years. The group listened in stunned silence. The fire crackled softly, its light casting flickering shadows on their faces. "What the hell is this place?" Amos muttered, looking over his shoulder as if expecting something to emerge from the trees. "Quiet!" Ephraim snapped. He closed the journal and stood, his sharp eyes scanning the perimeter of the clearing. "We'll take turns keeping watch. Samuel, you're first." The young trapper nodded, gripping his musket tightly as he took his position by the fire. The rest of the men tried to sleep, but rest was impossible. The forest seemed alive with faint noises, branches creaking, leaves rustling, and faintly, the sound of distant whispers. Samuel strained his ears, his heart pounding as he tried to focus. The whispers grew louder, still indistinct but undeniably there. He gripped his musket tighter, his knuckles white. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice cracking. The whispers stopped. Silence fell over the forest, heavy and suffocating. Samuel's breathing quickened as he scanned the darkness, his eyes darting from shadow to shadow. And then he saw it, a figure standing just beyond the firelight. It was a man, tall and thin, with features obscured by the darkness. "Amos?" Samuel called, his voice shaking, but the figure didn't move, didn't respond. "Amos, is that you?" Samuel tried again, louder this time. The figure took a step forward, and Samuel raised his musket, his finger trembling on the trigger. "Don't come any closer," he shouted. The figure stopped, and for a moment, Samuel thought it might have been his imagination. But then it tilted its head as if studying him, and spoke in a voice that made Samuel's blood run cold. "Samuel." It was his mother's voice. Samuel stumbled back, his musket slipping from his grasp. "No. No. You're not real," he whispered, his voice barely audible. The figure took another step forward, its features still hidden in shadow. But its voice was clear, gentle, and unmistakable. "Samuel, come with me. It's safe here. Come home." Tears streamed down Samuel's face as he shook his head violently. "You're dead! You're dead!" The commotion woke the others, and Ephraim was the first to react, grabbing his musket and rushing to Samuel's side. "What is it? What do you see?" But when Ephraim looked, the figure was gone. "I saw her," Samuel stammered, his voice breaking. "She was right there. My mother. She was right there." Ephraim grabbed Samuel by the shoulders, shaking him. "Get a grip, boy! It's this place! It's messing with your head!" The other men gathered around, their faces pale and drawn. The forest seemed darker now, the whispers louder. Ephraim turned to the group, his voice firm despite the fear gnawing at him. "We need to leave. At first light, we move. I don't care if we're lost. We keep moving until we're out of this cursed place." But as the fire crackled and the night dragged on, one horrifying truth settled over the group. The forest wasn't going to let them leave. Dawn broke reluctantly, its pale light filtering through the dense canopy above. Yet even in the daylight, there was no reprieve from the oppressive atmosphere of the forest. The shadows seemed deeper, more alive, as though they recoiled from the touch of sunlight. Each man's face bore the weight of the previous night. Tired eyes and stiff movements betrayed their unease. Ephraim Walker stood at the edge of the clearing, his musket firmly in hand, his expression unreadable but stern. "We're wasting no more time," he said, his voice cutting through the tense silence. "Whatever is out here, it's trying to break us. But we stick together. No straying off the path, if there even is one left." Despite his commanding tone, doubt lingered in the air, palpable and unspoken. Samuel, the youngest among them, kept glancing nervously at the trees, his grip tight on his weapon. "It won't let us leave," he muttered, barely loud enough for the others to hear. His words carried the weight of the fear they all felt, but refused to voice. "Enough of that," Ephraim snapped. "It's just a forest. Stay focused." But deep down, Ephraim knew Samuel might be right. They packed their camp hastily, keeping their movements efficient but quiet. The fire was extinguished, leaving no trace of their presence. Every man carried a weapon at the ready, their senses heightened, to the point of exhaustion. As they moved deeper into the forest, the landscape seemed to shift. The ground grew softer, and the dense trees pressed closer together, their twisted branches blocking out the light. It felt as if the forest was conspiring against them, changing its shape to confuse and trap them. Hours passed. The men walked in tense silence, their boots squelching in the damp soil. The air was heavy, thick with the smell of rot and moss. Ephraim took the lead, his sharp eyes scanning the terrain for any sign of familiarity, but there was none. The trail they had once followed had disappeared, and no landmarks remained to orient them. "We've been here before," Amos finally said, his voice breaking the silence. He pointed to a patch of moss-covered rocks that looked eerily familiar. "We're walking in circles." Ephraim stopped, his jaw tightening. "That's not possible," he said, though his tone betrayed his doubt. "It is," Amos shot back, panic creeping into his voice. "We've passed those same rocks twice now." "Keep it together," Ephraim barked. "Panicking won't help us." But the men's resolve was crumbling. Even Ephraim could feel it. The forest was toying with them, bending their sense of direction and time. It wasn't just the path that had vanished. It was as though the forest itself was alive, an entity determined to keep them trapped. As the group pressed on, the whispers returned. faint at first, like the wind brushing through the leaves. But there was no wind. The air was deathly still. The whispers grew louder, their indistinct murmurs weaving through the trees, taunting the men with voices that sounded achingly familiar. Samuel froze in his tracks, his face pale as a sheet. "Do you hear that?" he asked, his voice trembling. "Keep moving," Ephraim ordered, though his own grip on his musket tightened. But Samuel didn't move. He turned his head slowly, his wide eyes staring into the shadows. "It's her again," he whispered. "Who?" Amos asked, his voice edged with fear. "My mother," Samuel replied, his voice cracking. Before Ephraim could stop him, Samuel broke away from the group, running toward the trees. "Samuel!" Ephraim shouted, but the young man didn't look back. Ephraim chased after him, the other men close behind, but the forest seemed to close in around them. The trees grew denser, their twisted roots clawing at the ground, and the whispers grew deafening. "Samuel!" Ephraim called again, his voice swallowed by the unnatural sounds. They found him standing in a small clearing, his back to them, staring at something they couldn't see. His musket lay on the ground at his feet, forgotten. "Samuel, step away!" Ephraim commanded. But the young man didn't respond. As they moved closer, Ephraim saw what had captivated Samuel. In the shadows, just beyond the clearing, stood a woman. Her features were obscured, but her silhouette was unmistakably human. She reached out a hand toward Samuel, her movements slow and deliberate. "Samuel, don't!" Ephraim shouted, but it was too late. Samuel stepped forward, his hand reaching out to meet hers. The woman's figure flickered, like a flame about, to be snuffed out, and as soon as Samuel's hand touched hers, he was gone. The clearing was empty. No sign of Samuel, no sign of the woman. Ephraim and the remaining trappers stood frozen, their minds struggling to comprehend what they had just witnessed. Where did he go?" Amos stammered, his voice shaking. Ephraim didn't answer. His hands trembled as he clutched his musket, his stoic facade cracking. He turned to the remaining men, his voice grim and resolute. "We can't save him. We have to keep moving." But as they turned to leave the clearing, the forest shifted again. The path behind them had disappeared, replaced by more tangled trees and shadowy undergrowth. It was then they realized the horrifying truth. Samuel wasn't the only one the forest wanted. The forest grew darker as the remaining trappers stumbled. Onward, their ranks reduced to 7. Samuel's disappearance had left them shaken to the core. Each man carried the memory of his last moments, the eerie silhouette of the woman, Samuel's blank, entranced stare, and then nothing. The forest seemed to feed off their fear, wrapping them tighter in its suffocating grip. The trees loomed higher, their branches twisting unnaturally, forming grotesque shapes that looked almost human in the dim light. Ephraim Walker, usually unyielding in the face of danger, looked more haggard with every step. His eyes darted constantly between the trees as though expecting something or someone to lunge from the shadows. The journal in his pack felt heavier now, as if it carried not just words, but the weight of the curse itself. "Walker," Amos said, his voice barely above a whisper. "We've been walking for hours. We're going in circles again." "We keep moving," Ephraim replied firmly, though his tone betrayed a flicker of doubt. "It's not working," Amos shot back, frustration bubbling to the surface. "Every step we take, we're being pulled deeper into this hell. Samuel's gone, don't you see? We're all going to end up like him." Ephraim spun on his heel, his eyes blazing. "You think I don't know that? You think I'm not fighting? To keep us alive." His voice echoed through the forest, unnaturally loud in the oppressive silence. The men fell quiet, the tension between them stretching thin. No one wanted to admit it, but Amos was right. The forest wasn't letting them leave. They set up camp as dusk fell, the fading light casting long shadows that danced like specters across the undergrowth. Ephraim ordered double watches that night, unwilling to risk another disappearance. Amos took the first watch, sitting by the small, flickering fire with his musket across his lap. The others tried to sleep, though sleep came fitfully, haunted by the whispers that now seemed constant. As Amos stared into the darkness, he thought he saw movement, a subtle shifting among the trees. His heart began to race. He gripped his musket tightly and stood, straining his eyes. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice quivering. No answer. But the movement continued, closer now. Shapes darted between the trees, too quick to follow, too silent to be human. "Walker!" Amos hissed, panic rising in his chest. Ephraim stirred awake, grabbing his musket as he scrambled to his feet. "What is it?" "There's something out there," Amos said, pointing toward the tree line. The other men woke in a flurry, grabbing their weapons and forming a tight circle around the fire. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, as though they were coming from every direction at once, and then they saw it. A figure emerged from the shadows, its gait unnaturally slow and deliberate. At first it looked human, a man dressed in tattered furs, his face obscured by grime and shadow. But as it stepped closer, the men realized something was horribly wrong. The figure's movements were jerky, as though it were being controlled by invisible strings. Its head lolled to one side, and its eyes, milky and vacant, glowed faintly in the dim firelight. "Stay back!" Ephraim shouted, raising his musket. The figure stopped, tilting its head as if studying them, and then it opened its mouth, and the whispers poured out, not one voice, but many, overlapping and distorted. Amos fired first, the crack of his musket shattering the air. The figure staggered back but didn't fall. Instead, it straightened, its vacant eyes fixed on Amos. "Run!" Ephraim barked. The group broke into a chaotic sprint, abandoning the fire and their supplies. The forest seemed to come alive around them, branches clawing at their clothes and roots snagging their boots. The whispers followed, growing louder and more frantic, as though the forest itself was hunting them. They ran until their lungs burned and their legs felt like lead. Finally, they collapsed in a small clearing, gasping for breath. The whispers had faded, but the oppressive silence remained. "We can't keep running," Amos said between ragged breaths. "It's playing with us. It wants us to panic." Then, "What do you suggest?" Ephraim snapped, his frustration boiling over. Amos didn't answer. No one had a solution, and the weight of their hopelessness pressed down on them like a vice. As they sat there trying to catch their breath, one of the men, Jonah, stood abruptly. "Where's Marcus?" he asked, his voice shaking. The group froze, their eyes darting around the clearing. Marcus, one of the older trappers, was nowhere to be seen. "He was right behind me," Amos said, his voice trembling. "Did anyone see him go?" Jonah asked, panic creeping into his tone. No one answered. Ephraim stood, his face grim. "The forest took him." The realization settled over them like a dark cloud. They were being hunted, picked off one by one, and no matter how far they ran, the forest would always find them. As the night deepened, the remaining men huddled together, their weapons clutched tightly in their hands. But even their unity felt fragile, like it could shatter at any moment. And somewhere in the darkness, the forest whispered their names. The remaining 6 men stood motionless, their breaths shallow and their faces pale. Marcus's disappearance had shattered what little resolve they had left. Ephraim Walker, their once unyielding leader, now bore the look of a man haunted by failure, by fear, and by something far darker. "Listen to me," Ephraim said, his voice firm despite the chaos in his mind. "We're going to end this. The forest wants us afraid, scattered, but if we hold together, we can outlast it. This place isn't invincible." "How do you know that?" Amos asked, his voice dripping with skepticism. Ephraim hesitated. "He Didn't know. But if he let his fear show, the group would fall apart. It's a gamble, Ephraim admitted, pulling the curse journal from his pack. He flipped through its weathered pages, skimming the entries for anything that could give them an edge. His eyes locked onto a passage near the end, hastily written, as though the author had scrawled it in their final moments. They speak of a heart, Ephraim muttered. What heart? Jonah asked, stepping closer. The heart of the forest, Ephraim replied. The journal says it's where the curse began, a central point, deep in the woods. If we find it, if we destroy it... His voice trailed off. The group exchanged uneasy glances. It sounded insane, but insanity seemed to be their only option. You're saying we march deeper into this nightmare? Amos asked. Ephraim nodded. It's our only chance. The descent into darkness with no better alternative, the group pushed onward. The forest seemed to resist their every step, its twisted, branches clawing at them like living things. The ground grew softer and colder until it felt like they were walking on something alive. Hours passed, though it felt like days. The whispers grew louder, closer, their words still indistinct, but maddeningly familiar. The men tightened their circle, their fear drawing them closer together, and then they saw it. A massive tree stood before them, its trunk blackened and gnarled, its roots stretching out like veins across the forest floor. The air around it was suffocating, thick with the smell of decay. The whispers seemed to emanate from the tree itself, its dark branches writhing as if alive. The heart, Ephraim whispered. The group approached cautiously, their weapons drawn. The closer they got, the heavier the air became, pressing down on them like an invisible weight. Ephraim stepped forward, his eyes fixed on the base of the tree. There, tangled among the roots, was a strange object, a stone, pulsating faintly, with an unnatural red light. That's it, Ephraim said, his voice trembling. That's the source. Jonah stepped back, shaking his head. This is madness. How do we even destroy something like that? Ephraim didn't answer. Instead, he turned to Amos. Give me your axe. Amos hesitated but handed it over. Ephraim gripped the handle tightly, his knuckles white. If we destroy it, this ends, Ephraim said, more to himself than anyone else. As Ephraim raised the axe, the forest seemed to scream. The whispers became a deafening roar, and the ground shook violently. Figures began to emerge from the shadows, twisted nightmarish forms, their hollow eyes glowing faintly. They're coming! Amos shouted, raising his musket. Hold them off! Ephraim yelled. The men formed a defensive line, firing into the advancing horde. Each shot struck true, but the figures didn't fall. They dissolved into shadow, only to reappear moments later. Ephraim swung the axe, the blade biting into the stone. A blinding light erupted from the impact, and the tree let out an unearthly wail. Keep going! Amos shouted, his voice barely audible over the chaos. Ephraim swung again and again, each strike sending out waves of light and heat. The ground cracked beneath him, and the figures began to falter, their forms flickering like dying flames. With one final, desperate swing, the stone shattered. The forest erupted in a deafening scream, and the world seemed to collapse inward. The men fell to the ground, clutching their ears as the light consumed everything. The return to silence. When the light faded, the men found themselves lying in a clearing. The forest was still, its oppressive atmosphere gone. The twisted trees had returned to their natural state, and the whispers were no more. Ephraim sat up slowly, his body aching but intact. The others were scattered around him, alive but shaken. It's over, Ephraim said, his voice hoarse. Amos looked around, his eyes wide with disbelief. We're out? Ephraim nodded, though he didn't feel victorious. They had survived, but at what cost? Samuel, Marcus, and the others were gone, swallowed by the forest's curse. "We leave," Ephraim said, helping the others to their feet. "And we never speak of this place again." As they made their way back to civilization, the weight of their experience lingered. They had faced the unthinkable and lived to tell the tale, but some stories Ephraim knew were better left untold. Thank you for joining us on this terrifying journey into the unknown. If you enjoyed the Crux, scary horror stories, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. There are many more chilling tales to come, so stay tuned for the next spine-tingling adventure. You survived this story. Will you survive the next?